Look, sometimes you do things that seem completely logical at the time, and then everyone treats you like you've done something terrible. I'm Rachel. I'm 24, and I need you to hear the complete story before you judge what happened with my boyfriend Derek's living situation, because honestly, how this all unfolded was totally unjust to me, and I'm still trying to understand how everything became so distorted. So Derek and I had been together for 6 months when this entire disaster began. He's 27, owns his own place, nothing luxurious, just a standard apartment. But it belonged to him. I was trapped staying with my mother, which was essentially living in hell. She's got severe problems, substance abuse issues, always bankrupt, and she has this lovely tendency of taking money from me whenever she gets desperate, which happens frequently. She'd hold me responsible for everything terrible in her existence. Like somehow her troubles were my responsibility just because I was born. The woman couldn't maintain employment, couldn't handle expenses, but somehow I was the cause of her miserable life. Really mature behavior, right? When things became really terrible at home, Mom had another one of her breakdowns and stole $40 from my purse while I was asleep. Derek suggested I could stay with him temporarily. And listen, I wasn't attempting to relocate permanently or anything. I just needed somewhere secure to sort my situation out. He was considerate about it. Said I could remain as long as necessary, that we'd work it out together. For the initial month, everything was genuinely wonderful between us. We established our small routines. He'd prepare coffee each morning. I'd tidy up the apartment during the day. It felt normal, like what an actual relationship was meant to be like. But then my job became this complete disaster. My supervisor at the clothing store where I was employee, Dee, was one of those individuals who enjoys making everyone's life miserable. She'd watch me constantly, criticize every minor thing I accomplished, and then have the audacity to assign me these unpredictable shifts that made it impossible to maintain any sort of personal life. The breaking point was when she yelled at me in front of shoppers because I neglected to ask someone if they wanted to apply for the store loyalty card, like I'm attempting to process their purchase and she's having a meltdown over some ridiculous card application. I looked at her, looked at the customers watching us like we were performing some kind of spectacle, and simply left. I was finished with that poisonous workplace. Derek wasn't particularly pleased when I informed him I'd resigned, but I described the circumstances, and he appeared to understand it. I mean, who wants to remain somewhere they're being treated like trash? I assured him I'd begin searching for something else immediately, that this was just temporary. And I was sincere about it. I genuinely was, but job searching is draining, and most positions wanted to pay practically nothing anyway. Why exhaust myself for minimum wage when I could take some time to find something actually worthwhile? 2 months passed quicker than I anticipated. I'd submit applications to places occasionally, but nothing was really working out. Derek began getting this attitude whenever we discussed finances. Not hostile exactly, but you could sense he was anxious about handling everything. I felt guilty about it naturally, but it's not like I was lounging around doing nothing. I was making an effort. Sometimes these situations just require patience. You know, you can't force the perfect opportunity to appear. That's when Marcus started contacting me again. My former boyfriend from last year, we dated for approximately 2 months before I realized he was far too possessive and I had to break things off. I might have disappeared on him, which wasn't my best decision, but sometimes you have to be clear when men won't accept rejection. Anyway, he began messaging me suddenly, saying he'd been thinking about me, that he missed our conversations. Initially, I disregarded him. But then he sent this lengthy message about how he'd matured significantly, how he comprehended why I departed, and how he simply wanted to be friends. Honestly, it felt nice to have someone contact me who actually seemed to value me. Derek had been so preoccupied with expenses and work pressure lately that we hardly discussed anything else. Marcus remembered small details about me, inquired how I was managing, actually paid attention when I expressed frustration about my circumstances. We began messaging more frequently, and then he proposed we meet for coffee one afternoon while Derek was at work, just as friends, reconnecting. Nothing strange about it. The coffee meetings became a regular occurrence. Marcus would message me in the mornings. We'd meet somewhere in the afternoon, chat for several hours, then I'd return to Derek's before he arrived home. It wasn't like I was concealing it precisely. I just didn't see the purpose in making Derek concerned about something that was completely platonic. Marcus was different than previously. More grown up, less needy. He'd inquire about my job hunt, offer to help me prepare for interviews, actually provide helpful guidance instead of just telling me everything would eventually work out. And okay, perhaps there were some instances where things felt like more than friendship. Marcus would gaze at me the way Derek used to when we initially began dating, before everything became complicated with money and living arrangements. Sometimes our hands would brush when we reached for our coffee cups simultaneously, or he'd sit slightly closer than necessary when showing me something on his device. But we never crossed any actual boundaries. We were just connecting as individuals. There's nothing inappropriate about having a friend who understands you. The situation is, Derek and I never formally discussed being exclusive. We were cohabitating, certainly, but that was more about my housing circumstances than some major relationship pledge. I cared about Derek, obviously, but I wasn't prepared to eliminate myself from other opportunities just because we were in a convenient arrangement. Life is complex. Relationships are complex, and sometimes you need to maintain your options while you determine what you truly desire. Marcus began asking more questions about Derek, how committed we were, whether I was content, if I envisioned a genuine future there. And honestly, I found myself sharing things with him that I couldn't express to Derek, like how annoyed I was that Derek seemed more worried about money than supporting me through a challenging period. How he'd get this expression whenever bills arrived like I was some burden he had to bear. Marcus actually listened without making me feel ashamed for having emotions. Maybe I criticized Derek more than I should have. Maybe I mentioned to Marcus that living with Derek was temporary, that I was just determining my next step. But none of that was technically dishonest. It was all accurate from a certain viewpoint. I was figuring things out. I didn't know what the future contained, and if Marcus interpreted that to mean I was available, well, I never explicitly informed him I was unavailable either. The entire situation was perfectly manageable until Marcus decided to be theatrical and appear at Derek's apartment one evening. Derek and I were in bed watching something on his laptop when we heard this aggressive pounding on the entrance door. My stomach immediately sank because I had this terrible feeling I knew exactly who it was. Derek looked puzzled but got up to investigate, and sure enough, there's Marcus standing in the corridor, looking like he'd been weeping or something equally pathetic. "Why haven't you been responding to my messages?" Marcus asked, attempting to look around Derek to see me. "We need to discuss what occurred yesterday." Derek turned back to look at me with this expression I'd never witnessed before. Not furious exactly, but completely confused. "Do you know this person?" Before I could even process what was occurring, Marcus started ranting about how I was betraying him, how he couldn't believe I was living with some random man when we'd been working on reconciling. Derek's face went through about 5 different expressions in 10 seconds, while Marcus kept babbling about our coffee meetings and how confused he was about our status. I jumped out of bed and started shouting at Marcus to leave, calling him insane, telling Derek that Marcus was just some obsessed ex who couldn't accept that we were finished. But Marcus wasn't retreating. He kept discussing specific conversations we'd had, things I told him about Derek, details that made it obvious we'd been spending much more time together than I could explain away as accidental encounters. Derek finally managed to get Marcus to leave by threatening to contact the authorities, but the damage was completely done. Marcus walked away crying like the dramatic fool he's always been, but Derek just stood there staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. The questioning started immediately. How did Marcus know where Derek lived? How long had we been communicating? What did I tell him about our relationship? I went into full damage control mode, explaining that Marcus was delusional, that he was twisting innocent conversations into something they weren't. I told Derek that Marcus had been harassing me for weeks, that I'd been trying to handle it quietly without dragging Derek into the drama. Some of that was even partially accurate. Marcus had been persistent and I was trying to manage the situation. But Derek kept asking these specific questions that I couldn't answer properly without revealing more than I wanted to reveal. The worst part was how composed Derek remained through the entire interrogation. He wasn't shouting or throwing objects. He was just sitting there processing everything with this frighteningly neutral expression. Every lie I told seemed to make him more distant instead of more convinced. By the time we went to bed that night, I could tell something fundamental had changed between us, and I had no idea how to repair it. The following morning, Derek left for work without saying much, which wasn't completely unusual, but something felt wrong. I spent the day attempting to figure out how to explain everything in a way that wouldn't make me appear terrible. Maybe I could tell him that Marcus had been pressuring me to meet up, that I'd only done it to get him to stop bothering me, or that I'd been trying to help Marcus with some personal issues as a friend, and he'd misinterpreted my kindness. I had almost convinced myself that I could spin this into something manageable when Derek came home that evening with a completely different energy. "We need to talk," he said, and pulled out his phone. He'd received a message from Marcus on social media, a long, detailed explanation of everything. Our coffee, dates, the things I'd said about Derek being just temporary, how I'd complained about him being cheap and boring, how Marcus and I had been rebuilding our connection for months. Marcus had even sent screenshots of some of our text conversations, including ones where I'd called Derek, controlling for asking where I was going during the day. I tried to explain that Marcus was manipulating the context of those conversations, that he was making everything sound worse than it was, but there was no getting around some of the specific things I'd said. Like when I texted Marcus that Derek doesn't really understand me, or when I told him that living with Derek was just convenient for now. Seeing my own words reflected back at me through Derek's phone made them sound so much harsher than they'd felt when I'd written them. "Is any of this true?" Derek asked, scrolling through the messages. His voice was still calm, but there was something final about the way he was looking at me. I started crying, explaining that Marcus was twisting everything, that I'd never meant for any of this to happen. I reminded Derek about my impossible situation with my mom, how I'd had nowhere else to go, how grateful I was for everything he'd done for me. I told him Marcus meant nothing to me, that I'd cut him off completely if that's what Derek wanted. I promised I'd get a job immediately, that I'd make everything up to him, but Derek just kept shaking his head. "I can't do this anymore, Rachel. I can't be in a relationship where I don't know what's real." I begged him not to make any hasty decisions, that we could work through this if he just gave me a chance. I pointed out how good we were together most of the time, how this was just one stupid mistake that got blown out of proportion. I even offered to show him my phone to prove that I'd block Marcus everywhere and never speak to him again. "It's not just about Marcus," Derek said. "It's about the lying. It's about you complaining about me to another guy instead of talking to me directly. It's about you keeping secrets while I'm supporting you financially and emotionally. I need you to move out." The words hit me like a physical blow. Move out. Where was I supposed to go? Back to my mom's disaster of a life. I explained that I literally had nowhere else to stay, that he was basically throwing me out on the street over some text messages. I reminded him that I'd never actually cheated, that talking to an ex isn't some unforgivable sin. But Derek had already made up his mind. He gave me until the weekend to figure something out. 3 days to pack up my life and find somewhere else to live with no money saved and no job lined up. When I pointed out how impossible that timeline was, he just said he was sorry, but he couldn't pretend to trust me anymore. The conversation was over. I spent the next 2 days alternating between rage and panic. How could Derek be so heartless, so willing to throw away 6 months together over some misunderstanding? I called my one close friend Emma, but she was dealing with her own relationship drama and couldn't offer more than a couch for maybe one night. I looked into shelters and cheap motels, but everything required money I didn't have. My mom's place was looking like my only real option, which felt like the ultimate defeat. On Friday morning, I came back from a job interview to find all my stuff packed in cardboard boxes by the front door. Derek was at work, but he'd left a note saying he'd changed the locks, and I should leave my key on the kitchen counter. He'd packed everything carefully, my clothes folded properly, my toiletries in a separate bag, even my few pieces of jewelry wrapped in tissue paper. Somehow that made it worse than if he'd just thrown everything in garbage bags. The care he'd taken while essentially evicting me felt like the cruelest part of the whole thing. I sat on his front steps for 2 hours, hoping he'd come home and we could have one final conversation. When he finally showed up, he looked surprised to see me still there, but not sympathetic. I tried one last time to explain that Marcus had manipulated the whole situation, that I'd never meant to hurt him, that we could start fresh if he just gave me another chance. "I hope you figure things out, Rachel," he said, and walked past me into the building. That was it. 6 months of my life dismissed in one sentence. I had to call my mom to come pick me up, which was humiliating on about 15 different levels. She showed up 2 hours later in her beat-up car, complaining about gas money and making passive-aggressive comments about how she knew this would happen eventually. The drive back to her apartment was silent except for her occasional sighs and muttered comments about how I never learn. Being back at my mom's place was exactly as horrible as I'd expected. The apartment still smelled like cigarettes and disappointment. Bills were still piling up on every surface, and she still had the same toxic energy that had driven me to Derek's place in the first place. Within a week, she was back to her old patterns, asking to borrow money I didn't have, blaming me for various problems that had nothing to do with me, and making comments about how I'd burned my bridges with Derek. Marcus kept trying to contact me for weeks after everything exploded. He seemed to think that now that Derek was out of the picture, we could pick up where we left off. But I was furious with him for ruining everything. If he'd just kept his mouth shut and not shown up at Derek's apartment like some crazy person, none of this would have happened. I blocked him on everything, but he kept finding new ways to reach out. Different social media accounts, email addresses, even showing up at places he knew I might be. It was exactly the kind of obsessive behavior that had made me ghost him in the first place. The job search became even more urgent now that I was back to sharing a tiny apartment with my mom and her chaos. I finally found something at a call center. Not exactly my dream job, but it paid enough for me to start saving for my own place again. The work was mind-numbing, and the customers were mostly awful, but at least it was steady income, and they didn't care that I'd quit my last job without notice. 3 months after Derek kicked me out, I was scrolling through social media during my lunch break when I saw that he'd updated his relationship status to single. Not that I was keeping track of his profiles or anything, but we still had mutual friends, and these things show up in the feed sometimes. Seeing it in official Facebook terms somehow made the whole situation feel more fine than it had before. A few weeks later, Emma mentioned that she'd run into Derek at the grocery store, and he'd seemed really good, relaxed, happy, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. She didn't say it directly, but I could tell she thought he was better off without me. Even my own friend was taking his side in the breakup, which felt like a betrayal on top of everything else I was dealing with. The worst part was hearing through other people that Derek had started seeing someone new just 4 months after our relationship ended. 4 months. Like I was so easily replaceable that he could just move on without any processing time or grief about what we'd lost. I heard she was some girl from his work, probably one of those stable, boring types who would never create any drama or complications in his perfectly organized life. It's been 8 months since Derek threw me out of his apartment, and honestly, I'm still processing the whole experience. I'm finally in my own small studio apartment, which isn't much, but it's mine, and I don't have to deal with my mom's dysfunction every day. The call center job turned into something slightly better at a different company, so I'm making decent money now and rebuilding my independence. But I still think Derek completely overreacted to what was essentially a misunderstanding. Yes, I was talking to Marcus, and yes, maybe I said some things about Derek that I shouldn't have said, but I never actually cheated. And I never had any real intention of leaving Derek for Marcus. The whole thing got blown so far out of proportion because Marcus couldn't handle being just friends and had to create drama where none existed. What bothers me most is how quickly Derek gave up on us. 6 months together, and he couldn't even try to work through one rough patch. He just decided I was untrustworthy and threw away everything we'd built together. If he'd really cared about me, he would have been willing to fight for the relationship instead of just cutting me loose the moment things got complicated. I learned a lot about Derek's character through this whole mess, how he handles conflict, how quickly he can turn cold when things don't go his way, how he's not as understanding and supportive as he pretended to be in the beginning. Maybe I dodged a bullet by finding out what kind of person he really was before I wasted even more time on him. The people in my life who know the full story seem to think I'm somehow the bad guy in all of this, but they don't understand the complete picture. They don't know what it was like living with my mom's chaos, or how isolated and unappreciated I felt with Derek toward the end. They don't know how Marcus manipulated the situation to make everything look worse than it was, or how Derek refused to even consider my perspective before making his decision. I'm not saying I handled everything perfectly, obviously. Maybe I should have been more upfront about staying in touch with Marcus. Maybe I should have been more careful about what I said in those text messages. But people make mistakes, and real relationships are supposed to survive some bumps in the road. The fact that Derek couldn't handle one complicated situation tells me everything I need to know about what kind of partner he would have been long term. Now I'm focused on building my own life, my own stability, without depending on anyone else for my housing or financial security. I'm not looking for anything serious relationship-wise right now because I've learned that people can disappoint you when you least expect it. But when I am ready to date again, I'll know better what to look for in a partner. Someone who's actually willing to work through problems instead of just bailing at the first sign of trouble. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Marcus hadn't shown up that night, or if Derek had been more willing to hear my side of the story. But there's no point dwelling on what-ifs when I have my own future to figure out. I survived my mom's dysfunction. I survived being essentially homeless for a few months. And I survived Derek's rejection. I'm stronger now than I was before any of this happened, and that's something no one can take away from me. The whole experience taught me that you can't rely on other people to save you from your problems. You have to save yourself, build your own stability, and trust your own judgment about what's best for your life. Maybe that's a harsh lesson, but it's a realistic one, and honestly, I'm better off learning it now rather than later, when there might have been even more at stake.